things out, doesn't he? I'm not sure how long it was before my spiritual awakening, when my eyes were opened to who God is, who Jesus is, and all this spiritual stuff, all this invisible stuff. But it's one of those moments where it's etched in my mind, and I can see it, I can even taste it, I can feel it. I can go back to that memory as if it were yesterday or even 10 minutes ago. I can see it, it's etched in there. And there are certain memories in our minds that are etched in there, for better or for worse, right? But they're etched in there, and you can go back to those. And I go back to the dining hall where I was a college student, and I can remember sitting in a dining hall, and keep in mind, I'm an extrovert, okay? My life meaning comes from you all. Thank you for contributing. Extroverts, we're all about connections out there. We're known as the party animals and all that, but hey, we're so much more. Don't judge me. But extroverts find their meaning out there, okay? And then process it inside. Introverts, which is most of you statistically, introverts process stuff inside first. So Walmart crowds and things like that don't excite you. In fact, they kind of make you go the other way. I love Walmart on a Saturday. I love Walmart. There's so much energy. It's so cool. I love football games. I love crowds. I love all this stuff. But I realize I'm in the minority. But just to set the context, I am an extrovert for sure. That's where I find my meaning. I was sitting in the dining hall, my college campus. This is probably sometime during my sophomore year, and it's crowded with people. And I'm feeling absolutely and utterly alone. Absolutely and utterly alone. Crowded by people, friends. And I'm feeling absolutely and utterly alone. And I'll never forget, I can remember the table where I was, sitting behind the table. And people would greet me and say hi and all that, and slap me on the back. And I even think I had a little bit of wine beforehand, even though I was underage. But somehow, I don't know, I got some wine, maybe a glass or two or three. But even with the wine, even with the alcohol, even with stuff like that, and surrounded by people, I felt utterly, utterly alone, which is hell for an extrovert, okay? And I can remember the pain was palpable. Feeling the pain, it had a physical nature to it. And the one thing, when I think about when my eyes were opened in the spring of 1973, the one thing that I remember over everything else, and everybody remembers different things in their awakening, when your eyes are open to Jesus and God and all this stuff, different things happen for different people. But the thing that was right at the top for me was that I realized at a heart level, that I would never, ever have to be alone again. And it's been true. That I've gone through tough times with God, death of my wife and all sorts of things, challenges in my life and grief work and painful emotional stuff and all that. But never once, and I know that there's other experiences out there, but for me, never once has God failed on his promise to me that I would never, ever be alone. Not in that painful sense. Because God and I've wrestled with God. I've yelled at God. We've had our discussions at times, but he's never left me. Ever left me. The statistics on loneliness can be devastating. We're not talking about just solitude, because solitude has its own kind of feel to it. When you're out in the forest and you're just going, oh, wow, and or you're hunting or fishing or you're by yourself and it's a good, healthy thing, that's solitude. But loneliness is a different animal. And the stats on that are devastating. You would think that, in the age of cell phones and Snapchat and Facebook and all sorts of different kinds of social media, that we would be closer than ever. But just the opposite is true, that researchers tell us. That we are more lonely now than we have ever been before. And again, it doesn't depend upon the crowds of people, the friends that we know, or because the idea of loneliness begins inside of us. Researchers tell us that 1 in 3 people will be lonely this year. And I don't mean just having like a lonely night or a very brief period. This is where loneliness actually gets in the way of a healthy lifestyle, where it impacts on your life in some sort of significant way. 1 in 3. It's mostly younger people, and older people are susceptible. But it hits all of us, regardless of race, gender, background, philosophical or religious beliefs. It hits us all. It's an equal opportunity employer. Loneliness actually impacts us. Our bodies are impacted by loneliness. Researchers have found that it's worse than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Loneliness is actually worse for us health-wise than even obesity. So we can have a good potluck today, right? But don't be lonely about it. That's why this communion stuff is important. Loneliness does something. There was one researcher I was listening to on a TED Talk. One researcher said that they had started to investigate loneliness. And on a physiological basis, what happens to your body, interestingly, they did brain scans for people who were chronically lonely. And they found that the part of the brain that fires up when your body is being attacked, when you are experiencing a major infection or some sort of inflammation in your body, they found that that's the part of your brain that lights up and that your body goes into defensive mode. It feels like it's being attacked. That's what loneliness does. And one of the things that often happens with lonely people, or good people who are trying to help lonely people, and this was a warning and this was news to me, is that when you become lonely, what happens, chronically lonely, is that you begin to pull in, you do build walls, fortresses and stuff to defend yourself against other people. You become kind of cranky and even irritable, okay? And a lot of times, and I don't know if you've ever experienced that, if you try to help a lonely person, say, come on, let's go party, which is a good intention. But the person goes, no, I don't need to do that. No, thanks. And there's active resistance against that, and we take it as a personal rejection. And what's happening is just physiologically their body is reacting to the loneliness. And we don't realize that there's resistance that goes along with that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's a lot of dynamics to loneliness that we don't take into consideration. And some of us have gone through bouts of loneliness, okay? I can't speak from experience on that, but some of you can. And then it's not just a matter of, I'm feeling a little cut off. Sometimes you physically feel pain. I've talked to people who physically feel pain, physical pain, in the depths of loneliness, in that dark cave. It's interesting, too, that I was listening to another researcher, a cultural historian by the name of Dr. Faye Alberti. And she did historical research on the idea of loneliness, and she says it's interesting in her research that before 1800, the word loneliness isn't actively used. People would be in solitude, but there was always a sense of community before 1800. It's interesting. And that after the beginning of the 19th century, that we begin to see loneliness as a state of being cut off becomes more and more prevalent as we work our way through the 1800s and into the 1900s and to the present. Loneliness becomes more and more and more of an issue. And we were talking about that this morning in some ways related to this, is that we've lost our ties, our community ties, our sense of belonging with one another. Not just like church, but communities, families, communities, groups. We've lost our association with groups of people. And we buy into what Chuck Colson calls an obsessive individualism. We're obsessed with the individual, and we tend to forget what it means to belong to a community. And all throughout the Bible, it was interesting, I was trying to look at the Bible too, because I thought, well, what are some biblical examples of loneliness? And I racked my brain. I mean, there's places where people are alone, Elijah in the cave or Jonah up on the hillside or something, but it's not the kind of loneliness that we're looking at right now. In fact, I couldn't find a biblical example of modern day loneliness. And maybe what Dr. Alberti's words came echoing back. That we're experiencing, you might say, a pandemic of what it means to be lonely, what it means to be cut off. So I thought, well, what does the Bible have to say? And to launch us into kind of a biblical, get a feel for this, and we're not going to try to do all this today because it is potluck after all. But at least get a touch, at least start someplace. And I'd like to look at the next couple Sundays of what do we do about this? Not only in our own lives, but what about other people who are experiencing loneliness? Oh my goodness, how many people are on Facebook? How many people are on Facebook? I mean, incredible loneliness. I mean, Facebook becomes a platform for prayer, for me, praying for people. And occasionally, I don't usually respond, but occasionally I'll respond and just say, hey, if you need somebody to talk to, or whatever. We're so isolated. We're so isolated. But we'll talk about some of the practical aspects of that later on. But I want to just start with one central thing. And the launch point comes from another researcher. Her name is, I want to make sure I get it right, Olivia Reams. She's a researcher at the University of Cambridge in England, where loneliness has been studied, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But Olivia Reams says, this is a researcher, this is a TED Talk, this is not a church service or some religious thing. She says, if you want to get rid of loneliness in your life, you have to begin to see the world in a new way. If you want to get rid of loneliness in your life, you have to begin to see the world in a whole new way. And that's our launching point. Because while I didn't find lonely people in the Old or New Testament in the Bible, I did find a message that addresses loneliness. And it relates to seeing the world in a whole new way. And the message over and over and over and over in the Bible, which culminates in Jesus Christ, is that you are a connected being. You may have your ups and downs, highs and lows. You may have your feelings go all over the place. You may feel disconnected, just like I was in that college cafeteria. You can feel utterly alone, and those feelings are valid, and those are your feelings and all this. But the reality that the Bible points toward over and over and over again, whether it's Yahweh in the Old Testament or Jesu Christo in the New Testament, over and over again, is that the reality is that you are a connected being. Doesn't sound real religious, but it's very, very spiritual. You are a connected being. Well, I'd like to take us in our Bibles to Psalm 68. if you'd like to take a look at that. Psalm 68, verses 5 and 6 particularly. Psalm 68. And if anybody has a page number in the blue Bible, call her out. 420? Thank you. Psalm 68. It's a psalm of David. David certainly was in solitude places. He always had people and friends around him. And David, for all his imperfections, never lost that sense of God being with him. And in verse 5, he's singing, in verse 4 he says, "Sing to God, sing praises to his name, lift up a song for him who rides through the deserts," which is an interesting image. God riding through the deserts. "Whose name is the Lord, and exult before him." And then listen how he describes God, "a father of the fatherless, and a judge for the widow is God in his holy habitation." God, listen to this, verse 6, God makes a home for the lonely. God makes a home for the lonely. He leads prisoners into prosperity. Only the rebellious dwell in a parched land or a desert. But what did verse 4 say? Even those who are rebellious can see God riding through the deserts. God makes a home for the lonely. There is some sort of action, no matter how lonely we feel, no matter what we're going through in life, no matter how cut off we may feel at the time, there is an action, there is a movement of love that is flowing all around us, that is making a home for us. And that just because you have lonely feelings, and there's a lot of stigma stuff attached to feeling lonely, unfortunately, but even in your lonely feelings, there is a place where you are being loved actively. And it's finding that place to align our thoughts, I was going to say align our hearts, but I'm not sure that that's even possible. Maybe our thoughts. We can realign our thoughts to a reality that maybe we're not feeling at the time, but maybe can be open just a millimeter, open the door just a millimeter to be able to appreciate a truth that we're not feeling right at that time. That there are arms of love that are holding us tighter than we can imagine. Arms of love holding us, even on our lonely, angry, cut off, disconnected selves. And that those are the very arms of Jesus. The scarred hands, who experienced what it means, what it feels like to be cut off from the source of life. A father for the fatherless, a judge for the widow. When you're feeling the most helpless, when you're feeling the most powerless, God is there, advocating for you, even when you aren't for yourself. Other scriptures that come to mind, I was thinking about Genesis 2, where Adam is made and he's naming the animals and all this, and God says, he looks at Adam and he says, "It's not good for you to be" what? Alone. We're not just talking about solitary, we're talking about alone in that way. And from the very beginning of creation, God recognizes and says that people, we need to have that sense of connection to a larger life. Whether it's through marriage or family or friends or what have you, communities, political entities, national entities, global entities, a greater connection, that God builds that into Adam. And while Adam came out from the ground, and all the animals too, by the way, came out from the dust too. God uses dust as the common denominator, but he says, no, it's not good for you, Adam, to be alone. I'm going to build a helper suitable for you. And the Hebrew, we won't go into it, but that's full of all sorts of interesting meanings. But a suitable helper for Adam, suitable, appropriate, meets him where he is. And Eve becomes the only one who comes out of his side, comes out of his rib. And that's what God does, is he makes helpers for all of us in a larger sense. Those people in our lives, the ones we like, and some of them we don't like so much, but they're all part of a community voice of help to us, to keep us in what is the fullness of life, keep us connected. That's why we need each other. We need the prophetic voice of truth, the calling us into accountability. We need that soothing voice, that comforting voice of love, the whisper of encouragement. We need all of those voices, that symphony of voices, that when you or I are absent from that community and from that symphony, it makes a difference. It makes a difference. Other scriptures that came to mind, Romans chapter 8, verse 38 at the very end of the chapter, nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ. And when Paul says that, I believe that. I absolutely believe that. The whole leading up to that, verse after verse after verse, in the latter part of Romans chapter 8, is all about kind of expounding on nothing can separate you from the love of God in Christ. Even you can't. And what happens is we buy into a satanic lie, and it is a satanic lie, that we are disconnected, that we are no longer either worthy or compatible or acceptable or whatever. We buy into the lie that we are no longer connected, that we are all by ourselves. And it is an absolute lie. And it is a burden that we call sin. And we carry that burden. And God says, you don't have to do that. We go, yes, we do. Yes, we do. I'm just doing penance, And Jesus put an end to all that stuff once and for all. Nothing can separate you. Other scriptures. Psalm 139 is a great one. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from you? The psalmist says. Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the highest heights, you are there. If I go to the lowest depths, you are there. You are everywhere. Am I waking? Am I sleeping? You are everywhere, the psalmist says. Everywhere. We can't shake God, even if we tried our hardest attempts. You cannot shake God. He's right there, serving, loving, sacrificing over and over and over again. And you say, well, I don't deserve it. You're exactly right, but he does it anyway. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 11. At the end of the chapter, there are some amazing words. You've heard these before, but I want to reintroduce them again in this whole topic of loneliness. Matthew chapter 11, at the end of the chapter. And I have to believe that Jesus is looking at his own disciples. He's looking at people who have been following him for days, weeks, months, for a long time. And they're going through stuff, and he sees them. And he sees that they're tired, and that they've been carrying burdens, and that they're stressed and anxious, and their hearts are divided, and they're feeling lonely. They're feeling disconnected. And he feels that disconnection deep inside of himself. Jesus was always good at that. He feels that deep disconnection inside of himself. And he says at the end of chapter 11 in Matthew, he says in verse 28, he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Remember, when we feel lonely, we feel like we're under attack. At least our body feels that way. And our mind lights up like that. Our brain lights up like we're under attack. Something's attacking us. We're anxious. We're in fight or flight mode. We're ready to get going. The adrenaline is pumping and all this. And Jesus says, Shalom Aleichem. Peace be with you. Peace be with you. I will give you peace. You don't have to feel like you're under attack. I am gentle and lowly. This is not a normal picture of God, folks. Most pictures of God, the lightning bolts, it's Zeus, it's Roman gods, Greek gods, cranky gods, gods that if you don't toe the line, they're going to get all angry and ticked off at you. This is not a picture of God that we're normally used to, but Jesus presents this over and over again, that God is a safe place to be. In fact, it's the safest place to be. And it's only in God that we find rest. This is our home. It's that home in the best picture of the word. It's the hearth that is there and the fire's in the fireplace, and it's the place where everybody knows your name. Oh, that's right, that's a bar, isn't it? But it's a place where people accept you for who you are, warts and all, crankiness and all, goofiness and all, the craziness and all. God accepts you when you are home in his heart. When you allow yourself to be home with him, you are a connected person. And it's not just about this religious, we talk about a vertical and a horizontal thing. It really is all one. It really is. Read the book of 1 John sometime. You can't have one without the other. They're utterly interdependent, dependent. It's one concept. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. It's one law, Jesus said, one commandment in Mark. It's all connected together. And when you're home at God, when you allow yourself to experience, even in the midst of loneliness, that acceptance and that holding up of yourself with a power and a strength that is good. It's not destructive, it's good. And when you feel the goodness of God wrap you around, it opens you up to being connected to everybody else too. And not only human beings, but the earth and all its creatures, the stars in the universe. There's a whole new connection that begins to take place. And that sounds real theoretically wonderful to be able to do that. But it's in the nitty-gritty of our own personal lives and in the lives of those close to us, in the nitty-gritty of their lives and ours, that we work this out. And it is so hard, overcoming that thought of disconnectedness. But that's what we're going to talk about in the next couple of weeks. How do we do that? What does it mean, in the words of that researcher, to gain a whole new view of the world around us, that we might begin to understand how amazingly connected we are